Hello, welcome to award-winning John Mike's Virtual Tours of Scotland. We're delighted that you're joining us on this sunny afternoon in beautiful Glasgow. So we're going to do the usual thing. We're going live with a guided tour, and we've got a couple of Glasgow guides who we're going to introduce you to later on today. So we're going to start this tour from the cathedral area of Glasgow, and perhaps some of you have been here. It's the most beautiful ancient part of Glasgow. I'll give you something about Glasgow. It's got about over 1.5 million people staying here, so it's a much bigger place compared to what you've got in Edinburgh, which is just about 500,000. And the history of Glasgow, it was the second city of empire, a huge industrial focus here. And it really blossomed after the Act of Union, because in 1707 Scotland and England became united, and at that point there had been restrictions on who Scotland could trade with. We certainly couldn't trade with the English colonies, but once we united in 1707 then we could do that, and this became a big centre for the trading of cotton and sugar and tobacco, so a very prosperous, very big centre of industry and shipbuilding and many other pursuits also, and the fabulous River Clyde, which of course defines it. Now we're going to walk a little bit over here. I don't know if you'd like to come around here a little bit. These gates, memorial gates, are very much in what we call the Art Nouveau style, which is very connected with Charles Rennie Mackintosh. You may have heard of. I'm not going into too much detail about him just now. He was an architect, designer, and this actual gate here is dedicated to Joan Airdley, and we are celebrating the centenary of the birth of Joan Airdley with various exhibitions just now. She's one of my favourite painters, being a painter myself, great landscape painter, so very significant. And you can see here you've got the paint palette here and the brushes, and I just love all these little details to see these in metal there.
Highly stylised gating.
It is. And through here, we're maybe not going to get such a great view of it. It's a St Nicholas garden. This is usually open to the public, and this was for physic, in terms of plants would be grown here for good health, for curing illnesses, as well as culinary use as well. And it's all planted out as it would have been in the 15th century. And there's even information telling you what all the different plants would do. So we'll just take a little wander. It's closed just now because of COVID, unfortunately, but we're hoping that a lot of these places are going to open up in the near future. Glasgow University was located in this part of town going back to the 15th century, and connected with that, of course, the students at university would need books and publications, and this is dedicated to Fowlis, who were booksellers and printers. And if we take a little scan up, you can see the open book here as well, which I just love. So we will move down these little bells, of course, and again we'll tell you a bit more about why the bell is very significant in the symbolism of Glasgow also. Now this one here, I won't talk about them all, but this little memorial is to William Bryson, and he was a tailor, and he occupied Provand's Lordship, which is the oldest house in Glasgow, which we're going to have a look at, because it had been built for the canons. It had been built for the chaplain of the St Nicholas Hospital. We'll see this old house in a minute, and this would have been the herb garden for the St Nicholas Hospital. Now, by a hospital going back to the 15th century, this would have been more an almshouse. It wasn't really to cure illnesses and so on. It was really there to house usually elderly, poor men. Okay, I'm not saying anything too much about the women at the moment, but that's what it would have been for. And St Nicholas was patron saint of the poor, in addition to other things. So we've got this beautiful cloistered garden, very much in a sort of monastic style of architecture. At Glasgow, it was what it means was dear green place, and people used to comment about the perfume, the smells, and everything. So we're going to move to further down here. And we've got this beautiful little covered area of greenery here, with the trees here. Beautiful area for a walking tour. And we're going to look at this building here. You're going to get a better view of it in a minute. But if you notice the very small windows, this is called Provand's Lordship.
Do you want to spell that, Mike?
Yes, Provands, Lordship. Now, this area had various accommodations where the canons, it was Catholicism which was active here in Scotland in the 15th century. And the canons were like secular bishops. They were like people who got out into the community. And they had various lands and areas for cultivation, for living in. And the name Provand goes actually back to prebentary, which is connected with the prebend. And this is all to do with ownership of land and area connected with a certain bishop of Ballinark. And then it became abbreviated in history, and today it's Provand's Lordship. So it's like the Lord of the prebentary here. And if you notice architecture, it's got what we call rubble stonework. We can tell it's ancient because it's not like smoothed down or cut with machines. It's all very much probably from the top area where you could get stone going back to the 15th century, because you didn't have machinery to be able to source that back then. And of course the small windows too. So all this house in Glasgow,
Where does it date back to?
15th century, in the 1400s. And famous people who have stayed here include Mary Queen of Scots.
Where did Mary Queen of Scots not stay?
I know, where did she not stay? And it was yet another occasion when she was hooking up with that dysfunctional husband of her, Henry Darnley. So we get a better view of Provand's Lordship.
I think Mary Queen of Scots stayed in my mum's house as well.
I think she probably did. So just going to cross the street very, very carefully here. And now if we take a little look down the street before we go back to Provand's Lordship, this would be the High Street. At the top of the High Street, this is in the eastern part of Glasgow, was a cathedral. And a lot of the history of Glasgow comes from the founding of that church. There was a church in this area going back to the 6th century and connected with St Mungo or St Kentigern, and we've spoken about him with regard to Couros, but you'll be hearing more about that. I'm not going into too much detail. So there was a religious site founded here in the 6th century, and you've got a little bit of what the Royal Mile in Edinburgh is, although it's very much modernised with all the traffic, because you would go all the way from the top of the town right down to the River Clyde, and you would get to the toll booth, you would get to the market cross, you would get to all the symbols of this being a great trading centre. Okay, so great university town as well, of course. A city is Glasgow. Now we're just going to let people pass here. We're still doing a socially distant, and you can get a bigger view of Provand's Lordship at the moment. Now this was going to suffer. It was probably going to be demolished had it not been for a famous shipbuilder called William Burrell. And in the 19th century, he was able to save this, and today many of the furnishings, including beautiful tapestries and paintings and various other domestic items, are in here today, and you can visit and take a walk through history in this 15th century building. Right, so Provand's Lordship. Beautiful day today. So we've got a nice open area, and we're going to maybe take a little look at this thing here. It's like a very tactile. This is for probably be very useful for people with sight difficulties, in that you can feel all the sculpture here and you can get a feel of the layout. So we've got Provand's Lordship here. We actually just walk down here, and then we are actually walking over here to the cathedral precinct, and we've got the cathedral here. Okay, and over here is the infirmary, and I'm just going to talk about that before I leave you in the good hands of Joe and our Glasgow guys, but we'll move over to the infirmary here. You'll not believe we came from Edinburgh today and it was raining and it was cold, and in my bag I've got a raincoat and a woolly hat, and as soon as I come to Glasgow, wonderful.
25 degrees here.
It's amazing. Over here we might just get a little view of David Livingstone here. David Livingstone came from Blantyre, born in Blantyre, very close to Glasgow. He was a missionary, an explorer, and one of his occupations was finding the source of the Nile. And he discovered the Victoria Falls. Well, a lot of the natives wouldn't really say he discovered them, but he was able to gift the Victoria Falls a name to Queen Victoria. But he was one who was carrying the Christian message to Africa. And he believed that, well, slavery was a big issue there, but he believed that if he could be seen as a famous explorer, he would use his fame to help to put down slavery. And all around here, at the bottom of the plinth, you can see there he is reading his Bible there. And of course the famous occasion when Henry Morton Stanley, I was talked about this before, from the New York Herald, went over to Africa to find Livingstone, who had disappeared. He did find him, and the famous was Dr. Livingstone, I presume, but he maybe never even said that, and there's a film made about it. So David Livingstone, famous son of this Glasgow area. Now, over here is the infirmary, Glasgow Infirmary, and this dates from the 19th century. There was an older building here before in the 18th century, and it was designed by the architects, the Adam family of architects. And the older building, fine though it was, had to be taken down because it really couldn't cope, because there was an outbreak of cholera in the 19th century. I think it was sort of like 1849 sort of time, and many people were dying and had to be treated, and the hospital was overcrowded, so they had to keep building extensions and extensions. And one Lord Lister, who is a famous medical name, who pioneered antiseptic surgery, like cleaning instruments, cleaning everything, that the protective gear that these surgeons and doctors would wear. And today we've got the name Listerine mouthwash, named after Lord Lister. But there was a real terrible event when they were actually extending the hospital in the 19th century, because they realised that they were treating patients over an ancient graveyard, and there were many bodies underneath. And this whole area of Glasgow had suffered so much from deprivation, from illness. Okay, I think you maybe still hear me. That they had to, that interrupted the building and development of the hospital. But then it progressed, and there was even a lot of bodies interred under the cathedral here as well. But maybe you'll be hearing a bit more about that when we pass on to our local guides.
So it's a real pleasure to come to Glasgow and to also engage with some of our local Blue Badge guides. Now, the Scottish Tour Guides Association has got various branches. There's the Edinburgh branch on the east coast, and then there's the Glasgow branch on the west coast. And we always think it's a good thing to do if we've got local guides here to introduce them, bring them on board so that they can tell us a bit more about their own cities and their own developments that they're doing. Now, Mike's already mentioned the tours that we're doing in Edinburgh. So let me introduce you to Alistair MacDonald and Lynn Ramsey.
Hello, hi there.
And
Hello.
Blue Badge Guides here based in Glasgow. And you have been instrumental in developing tours which are going to launch very shortly.
Yes, that's right. My name's Alistair. So yes, we weren't to be outdone by the Edinburgh crew. The Edinburgh branch did the Tall Tales, but we have our own tour that we are doing as well. There's a great rivalry between Edinburgh and Glasgow. That's what
Never.
you're going to find. That's true. And just a little secret for you, our tour is absolutely fantastic. And
Who
it's
would say
called
that?
Glasgow Glorious and Gruesome, a tale of two cities. And actually one of the main people behind it and the originator of the idea is actually Lynn. So I think Lynn would be in a good position to tell us a little bit about that. So I'll just pass on the mic to Lynn.
Okay, hi there, my name is Lynn Ramsey. So, as Alistair said, we were not to be outdone by Edinburgh. and the Edinburgh branch. So we decided to look at a kind of different kind of tour in Glasgow. So as has already been mentioned, you saw a little bit of the High Street. Okay, it's quite modern now, but that was the street in Glasgow hundreds of years ago. And so our tour starts here outside the Cathedral and Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and it weaves its way down the High Street, telling you lots of stories. Now, as we've already heard, there are some very famous people who have developed medical or have achieved a lot medically here at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary, but we're also going to tell you a little bit about body snatching, grave robbing. It just didn't happen in Birkenhead in Edinburgh. Glasgow had its own grave robbers, and there were some pretty hideous, grave robbers around. So we're going to tell you a little bit about that, and we're going to take you down to Glasgow Green. And Glasgow was very good at hanging people way back in the day, so we'll be telling you what they did with some of the heads, shall we say. But we will also be telling you all about the wonderful achievements of Glasgow as well. And one of the things I would like to say is we were the first city in the world who gave the freedom of the city to Nelson Mandela. There's no other city in the world who can say that, and so we will end our tour on a note like that round at our Civic Square in George Square. So I'm going to pass back to Alistair. He might tell you a little bit more about himself.
Yes, we are all members of the Glasgow branch of the Scottish Tourist Guides Association, and I'll tell you one thing that cropped into my head that hadn't been mentioned. You mentioned Lister. I'm just thinking about the building behind you. And Lister, can I come round this way?
Yeah.
And you can show the building. So obviously you can see Queen Victoria. I don't know if you can quite see Queen Victoria there. And this building was completed in 1914, and it was one of the home of Lister, who was a pioneer of antiseptic surgery, as Mike has said. But there was also a pioneer of many other fields of medicine as well. Radiology. The first radiology department was at Glasgow Infirmary, and another first was ultrasound. And Ian Donald was a person that developed ultrasound, and the connection there is quite interesting, because the reason that he developed ultrasound as a medical means, a medical sort of instrument, was because it was already being used in shipbuilding, and that's another one of the great stories of Glasgow, is shipbuilding. So they used to use these devices to test for hairline cracks in the metal of ships, and he decided that he'd take a trip down there. He stuck his finger in one and he thought, well, perhaps I'm onto something. So this is a site and a centre of some great medical advances, and it continues to the present day. Glasgow University's medical department is one of the finest in Europe, one of the finest in the world, really.
And just tell me, how many universities, for the viewers here, how many universities are there in Glasgow?
Well, there are 4. There are many more. There are quite a few educational institutions, but there's 4 universities. Glasgow University,
which is the oldest.
That's the oldest, so that's 1451. Yep. Caledonian University is another one. Strathclyde University, which grew out of an institution, a technical institution, quite an early one called the Andersonian Institution. And we have the University of the Highlands and Islands, have a big campus here, and they have campuses elsewhere in Scotland as well. Yep.
So again, universities, education, big industry here in not just in Scotland but in Glasgow as well. So Edinburgh and Glasgow, huge destination, especially for international students as well.
Absolutely.
We're very proud of our big sister city here as well. Although they always say there's always animosity, or there's a friendly rivalry between Glasgow and Edinburgh.
Friendly rivalry indeed.
So we're going to start a bit more about the actual history of the city itself. We're going to walk around. We're going to, somebody's already mentioned it, we're very close to Necropolis. We're going to end up in the Necropolis. Well, a bit more about that. But we're going to ask Lynn and Alistair to give us a wee talk about the cathedral, and a bit of history about that. Maybe also about the story of the coat of arms, which we'll show you as well.
Yes.
And we'll continue walking and talking as we go, and we'll continue our blethers.
So Glasgow has a population, actually the city of Glasgow actually has a population of about 650,000. But Greater Glasgow, as I think Mike said earlier on, the greater sort of metropolitan area, that's about 1.5 million. So it is quite a centre. In fact, about a quarter, almost a quarter, a fifth to a quarter of the population of Scotland lives in the central belt, basically between and including Edinburgh and Glasgow.
And what do you call people from Glasgow?
Glaswegians.
What do you really call each other? Ouijies.
Ouijies is the name. That's absolutely correct. although I'm not actually from Glasgow originally, I'm from the northeast, actually quite close to where Mike comes from, in the northeast. So this is the cathedral. So Glasgow really started off in two different places, you can see. There was, from time immemorial, there were tiny little fishing villages up the River Clyde and out at the estuary in the River Clyde. And one of those tiny little fishing communities since time immemorial was down at the foot of the hill here on the River Clyde. Then, round about the middle of the 500s, along comes a gentleman you've already heard of, St Kentigern, otherwise known by his nickname St Mungo. St Mungo is a nickname meaning the dear one or the beloved one. And he establishes a religious community on this site. And right here, there would have been, back in the 500s, the middle of the 500s, a tiny little wooden hut. And that would have been the chapel. And there would have been a small collection of devotees to the new faith that was essentially arriving with these proselytising monks, many of whom came from Ireland. And St Mungo arrived here and established the community. And gradually, over the following centuries, the two communities sort of became linked up. The little fishing community and the religious community, more or less on the line of the high street that you saw earlier on. So that's how Glasgow grew. And it grew, and it grew, and it grew. And eventually, of course, it moved into the Georgian period. That's when all sorts of mercantile activities started to happen. You have tobacco, you have sugar, you have cotton being imported. At one time, 70% of all tobacco imported into Europe came through Glasgow. And there's a couple of interesting reasons for that as well. But actually, the city came into its own, as we've already heard, after 1707, after the union of the parliaments. And that is when these very active and with pent-up energy merchants of Glasgow get their hands on something important, and that's the English territories and the English plantations out in North America. So this cathedral you see behind me, it starts as a wooden structure. It becomes, in the 1100s, they start to build an early stone structure, and then by the 1200s, middle of the 1200s, the classic era of Gothic architecture, you see the building behind us now. And it goes through several reincarnations. And I think, shall I pass on to Lynn to have a little blather about some more stuff?
Okay.
Yep.
And could I just point out that you'll see that some of the stonework is quite black, and that has obviously come from, over the years the industry has blackened it, and you'll also see that some of the stonework has been replaced. So there is an organisation in Scotland called Historic Environment Scotland, and they help to repair the stonework, and they actually have apprentices who learn how to repair that very old ancient stonework. So unfortunately they can't quite blacken it the same as the original, but that's why you'll see some different coloured stone.
But it is a testimony to the industrial powerhouse that Glasgow was. Yeah.
Yes, it was a very black place. Inside the cathedral, unfortunately, we can't see today. It has the most magnificent stained glass windows that are dedicated to some of the fallen heroes from the wars, and also have been. They depict the trades houses of Glasgow, the different professions that grew up around, as Alistair said, all of the industry that was. Made Glasgow so wealthy, and it became so wealthy that it became the second city of the empire, which is maybe perhaps hard to believe now, but Glasgow was the second city of the British Empire. So I wanted to draw to your attention, if Mike could go up there, you'll see on the lamp post, you'll see right at the very top in the middle a bird, and then you'll see leaves from a tree. Then you'll see a fish with a ring and a bell. And these depict the four legends and are on the four legends of St Mungo. And we will see, as we go down the high street in one of our tours anyway, some depictions of that. But these are the four legends that grew up around St Mungo. And I think I'm going to get this in the wrong order. But
we're here to help.
The bird that never flew, the tree that never grew, the fish that never swam, and the bell that never rang.
Yep.
And there are lots of legends around why these came about. I don't know if we've got time to see any of them.
Do you want me to go through some?
Yes, I think I
Okay.
would like you to go through.
So
camera shy.
The story goes, again, I always say, I've got a mic here. So the story goes, and remember I've said before that when you come to Scotland, there's always truths, half-truths, and anything but the truth. So I'm going to give you the story that I've got about this. So St Mungo was the pet student of one of the great monks over in Kouros. We've been to Kouros, we've talked about that before. But he was left in charge for a lot of duties, and one of his duties he was to look for was to look after this pet bird that the monk had. But it's said that his fellow students or fellow pupils at this school didn't quite like St Mungo to a great extent, so they wanted to play tricks on him, and they actually killed the bird. So Mungo wakes up and he sees the bird dead, and he picks it up and he breathes on it, and the bird comes back to life. So this is one of his first miracles. The second one goes about the tree. Again, keeping the fire going was really important in those days. Fire was extremely important. So one of Mungo's jobs was to keep the fire going. However, he got up one morning and the other fellow students he was with had put the fire out. No. So what does he do? He goes out and he gets a hazel branch and again breathes on it, and the hazel branch goes into flames again. Is that right? A frozen hazel branch, and he brings it in, and then the fire starts. So the miracle the reputation for miracles starts to grow. One of his jobs, again, there was another holy man there called Saint Fergus, and he died. And the job was to take Fergus on a trailer with two bulls, and he was to take this trailer wherever the bulls stopped. He was to build the church. And it actually stopped here. So this is where the little hut started here. Now Mungo got to know the local tribes here. Again, they were out here to convert them to Christianity. And he got to know one of the high hegions, or one of the lords of one of the tribes here. And it was said that his wife was given a ring. This ring was a part of a treasure of the king. But she was having an affair, apparently. And she gave the ring to her suitor, and they were out hunting one day, and the king was with the suitors, with one of the second in commands, and saw that he was wearing the ring, but they decided they would go into the Clyde for a swim or to hunt, and they would take everything off, including the jewellery, and it was then when the king took the ring and he threw it in the water. When he came back, the king then, or the lord, said to his wife, "Well, where's that ring I gave you?" Of course, she was busted because she had given the ring away. So she comes up to church here, she talks to Mungo. Mungo then sends one of his acolytes down to the river, which is only a couple of 100 yards down the road there, and he was to catch a fish, the salmon, and bring the salmon back. And they cut the salmon open, and what was in the salmon? The ring. So there's another miracle going on, and I quite like Mungo liking it, because it means, normally a fallen woman would be dealt with in a different way, but he let her off. And so the reputation for miracles started to grow. The bell was then gifted by the Pope in Rome to be here in Glasgow Cathedral, but when it got here it cracked, so it never actually rang. And so that's where you get the poem. Do you want to say it again, Lynn?
The bird that never flew, the tree that never grew, the bell that never rang, and the fish that never swam.
And this is the coat of arms of the city of Glasgow. You will see this everywhere. Everywhere, on bus stops, on your bills. You get
bills, sometimes,
bills.
yes.
Yeah, you'll see these symbols here. Yeah.
And I don't know whether they still do it, but children in Glasgow, when they started primary school, which is elementary school, that was a rhyme that they were always taught.
Yeah.
They had to recite that.
And who was the group in Glasgow? The Glasgow group, was it Hue and Cry that did the song?
Yes,
I think it was Hue and Cry, yeah.
Yeah.
The tomb of St Mungo is in the cathedral as well. Mm-hmm. And for those of you who are Outlander fans, a big scene where I think it was in series 1, where they're talking about the nuns and they're with the nuns in Paris. They actually use this as the lower church here as a location. And again, it's quite interesting here that this church actually one of the few churches in Scotland that actually survived the Reformation as well. And remember, we talk a lot about the Reformation when we went from being a Catholic country to a Protestant country, but this cathedral was protected by the locals, so it was never destroyed, like St Andrews or a lot of the other churches throughout Scotland. Yeah?
Yes, as Joe said, this cathedral's a rather rare survivor because there aren't many cathedrals in Scotland that survived the Reformation, and Joe's absolutely right. It was saved by the locals who were so determined that this fine structure wouldn't be lost. Now, we call it a cathedral, but of course it's not really a cathedral. The proper name for this building, it is a proper name for the building, but it's really a historical title. It was a cathedral, it's no longer a cathedral. The proper name for this is the High Kirk of Glasgow, because, of course, that's fine. So, of course, we don't have this after the Reformation. That was the time when people in Scotland and many other parts of Europe rejected the authority of the Pope, rejected Catholicism, and the new incoming faith was Protestantism. And those people who protested against Catholicism, well, they were called Protestants. And the exact form of Protestantism that really took off in Scotland was Presbyterianism. But there are no bishops in that form of religion, that sect, I suppose you could call it. That is more a Catholic thing. So, strictly speaking, a cathedral or a cathedra is the seat of a bishop. So without a bishop, you can't really have a cathedral. So that's one of the little points. Historically, it's called a cathedral. But one of the people, of course, John Calvin was one of the main movers and shakers that a guy called John Knox followed. And John Knox, can you see over my shoulder, up on the hill, this series of sort of structures you see on the hill here, this is the Glasgow Necropolis. And I think Joe and Mike have planned to have a little visit at the Necropolis later, so perhaps more of that later. But just if I can point out the main statue at the top, because it's very strongly linked into the cathedral and the story of the cathedral, because this is John Knox.
And if you were watching last week, you'll see we were in the new college in Edinburgh, and you saw the very similar statue of John Knox standing over with his Bible in one hand, and he's telling the nation off the other. And it was like, we always used to have this joke in Edinburgh when if we went to a party and somebody was John Knox, they used to say, you have nae fags, nae booze, and you have to make your own entertainment. Exactly. There was no fun. There was no fun with the fundamentalists.
No, I know he wrote. That's right. He did. I don't know if he'd be much of a party animal, to be honest. I don't think so. He wrote a book, and the book he wrote several books, but one of the books he wrote was called The Last Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. Now, I don't know how much that's selling at the moment. Not that hot a seller, I don't think. It's probably still in print. It's a very important text in the history of Scotland, so you can look that one up. It seems like a humorous title at the moment, but he, of course, wasn't in favour of Mary, Queen of Scots, being on the throne, and he wasn't very keen on Elizabeth being on the throne down south as well. So just thinking about that statue and thinking about the reasons behind the Reformation, what were they? Well, there were multiple reasons, but one of them was that you weren't into sort of idolatry. You wanted to rip down all the statues and all the sort of craven images. So isn't it a little bit ironic, just as in Edinburgh, that one of the biggest and most impressive statues in the whole of the city is, of course, John Knox.
John Knox, I know. There is an irony. The Scots do irony very well.
I was just going to say a few things about the architecture of the building. It is amazing. You've had Alistair and Joe and Lynn talk about this amazing church, but they have got a lower church. You know, you might automatically think that's a crypt for burials, but at one point there was 3 churches here up until the 19th century because it had been designed as a Catholic cathedral, I suppose, a massive church. And then with Presbyterianism and people going to church under that new label, if you like, then they had to accommodate them all in 3 separate churches. So down below, where the tomb of St Kentigern was the lower church, and then that was the barony church. And then in the 19th century, they built another building, and we'll maybe swing around. We can see that just slowly down, not to make you too dizzy. That red building there, and then they moved out of there. But then, which I think is very spooky, they started doing burials in the lower church, and they had all this earth stacked up and the bodies buried under there. So that wasn't very healthy. And of course, you've got your big hospital beside you too. So that was just another ironic thing that was happening here.
It means the city of the dead, basically. And it was actually built because of the unhygienic cemeteries that were all around here. There was breakouts of cholera, and it was decided in the 1800s they had to do something about this. And part of the reasons for the cholera outbreaks where's all the bodies? Because underneath the cathedral here, there is a little river, a brook, a burn, as we call it, and occasionally that would flood, and the bodies would come up as well. So cholera was widespread here in industrial Glasgow in 1800s, and we're going to take you a walk up to show you the necropolis as well.
And if I could just point out that the red sandstone building, which was the Barony Church, when Strathclyde University came into being by royal assent in 1964, the Barony Church is now where Strathclyde University has all its graduations.
Yep.
It's obviously a modern university, so it doesn't have an ancient building where you can have the graduations. So that is where graduands of Strathclyde University graduate from, and it's a pretty spectacular building as well.
And just continue with, as we're walking now, you get some better views. You get good views of the cathedral from different angles as we go around it. But this is the official church or High Kirk, where the Queen, if she's visiting Glasgow, will use Glasgow Cathedral as her church as well. Just want to look at these spectacular gates as we walk into the necropolis itself. You can see the symbol of the ships here. Again, you see this a lot in Glasgow because obviously the mercantile history of the city. We've talked a lot about the dynamism of the various cities. We were in Dundee a few weeks ago, and we talked about the dynamism there, the change that's taken place. Well, I think it's fair to say that Glasgow would have led this, because I think it's fair to say that Glasgow kind of hit hard times in the 1960s and 70s with the decline of the industries, particularly the steel, the coal. Glasgow was famous for building the steam engines for the Indian railways. It was a huge manufacturing city, but competition from other countries, changes in law, and just in general, the shipbuilding declined, steel declined, everything declined. And it's fair to say Glasgow kind of went backwards, didn't it?
Yes. The population, for example, the population, actually the city centre is now about 650,000, but in 1938 it reached its peak and it was about 1.3 million. So it's dropped since then. And that's because the industry, of course,
and
suffered.
Emigration, people emigrated from the city, people left the city, people... Glasgow's always had a dynamic history in terms of immigration, because it was a big jumping off point for people who go into North America, Canada, the United States throughout history. But with the decline of the industry, a lot of people would then distribute themselves across the rest of the UK. People had to go look for jobs. And it was just a tough place to live. The trigger, I believe, was the Garden Festival.
Garden Festival, 1988.
1988. And that, to me, was the trigger for the whole change of mentality of Glasgow, because it just reinvented itself. Don't know what happened. I mean, the city council was so forward thinking at the time, but it seemed to have changed people's mentality. Yes. And then it won the European City of Culture. And then started to export the knowledge of how to become a city of culture to other cities in Great Britain and in Europe. And so a whole industry about how to reinvent yourself started here. And I think it's continued, because now big financial centre, all the new industries, and graduates who study here stay here. Normally, when I was growing up, if you studied in Glasgow, you left.
Moved, yes.
But now it's attracting so many new students who are coming over here and building up the, internationally renowned universities, and also become much, much more cosmopolitan, because we always used to regard Edinburgh as being a more cosmopolitan international city because of its history, because of being the capital. But Glasgow has got so many different nationalities here now, and it's grown tremendously.
Very cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
It is a UNESCO City of Music as well. It's got a very thriving music scene that crosses all of the spectrum of musical tastes, and we have a very vibrant traditional music scene as well in Glasgow.
Well, you've got the Celtic
Connections in
Festival.
January, where artists from all over the world come along, and they are absolutely desperate to come and perform. And it was, unfortunately, we weren't able to hold it this year, but it was held virtually as well. But if I could just come back to just a kind of personal anecdote. Glasgow was very famous for shipbuilding, but it was also for locomotives, for train locomotives. And there was a very large company just north of here, North British Locomotive. And what they would do is they would take the locomotives down on the tram lines right down to the Clyde side, and then there was a huge crane if you come here on the Clyde, and they would deposit them into the ships that took them all over the world. So there were thousands and thousands of locomotives that went all over the world.
Canada, Australia, India,
South
and you
Africa.
still use them in India, still use them in South
them,
Africa? Yeah.
yes.
Amazing.
So as we heard this whole thing about regeneration of Glasgow, we're very, very good at it, but we're still working on it down at the Clyde. And if you were able to come to Glasgow, then there's a whole host of things going on down there as well. However, I think we're going to go back to...
No, carry on talking about it. I
What
just
you
wanted
do?
to introduce some things. As we're walking down here, we want to show you some of the monuments. There's a lovely little monument here, and this is the monument for children who've been stillborn here, and we're going to pass some others. So this is a nice little quiet place for people to come and spend some time, and it's a monument to the stillborn children here in Glasgow. This is a little walkway that was built by the merchants in the 1800s to link the cathedral over to the necropolis when they started to build.
I'd just like to, sorry, but just button in just now. I'd just like to make a comment. I'm swinging the camera around quite a lot. I'm not wanting to make you dizzy, and the reason for that is the sun. We have got quite a lot of sun at the moment, and I'm trying to get good angles where we're not going directly into the sun. But before after that, I'd just like to say something about the American connection with music, and we've got the Grand Old Opry here also in Glasgow. And probably dates back to a lot of immigration people from Glasgow, from the West, going to America. And they used to send back the comics, they used to send back everything to do with the music, and still a big tradition of line dancing at the Grand Old Opry. And I can say also that the dress and appearance of the Glaswegians is something very cool. I would say very fashionable about them, and I don't know where they've got that from. Maybe it's the Irish in them, because there's lots of, it's a lot of Irish and a lot of Highland, and this is where the piping centre happens to be. It's not in Edinburgh, because there's probably many more pipers here in Glasgow, and it's also where the World Pipe Band Championships are held. Sadly not this year, but in August every year.
Yeah, and in Edinburgh we've got the Royal Mile. In Glasgow you've got the Style Mile.
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
true, yes.
So it's got the
Buchanan Street.
Buchanan Street. It's got more shops per square footage than any other city apart from London.
Well, yes, exactly. Apparently, for a period, I don't know if it's still the case, I think it's still one of the highest revenue-generating streets in the UK. In fact, I think it's the highest outside of London, which is quite impressive.
I used to commute over. I used to work over here, and when you finish work, all the people that I worked with, they'd all be getting ready to go out, but they wouldn't go home. They would stay. They'd get changed in the office, and they used to call it the cappuccino hour. So they'd all meet with their friends, and then they'd go straight out. Whereas in Edinburgh, you'd go home, and the people in Glasgow would say you go home and they put their baffies on, they put their slippers on, and come out again, because people here dress up. People in Edinburgh tended to dress down.
I've never heard of a cappuccino hour, because
Never heard
it
of
wasn't
it?
cappuccino that you drank when you were getting changed, to be honest. Sorry.
Gin and
Not that I would tell any of the employers that, but hey, it was something a bit stronger than cappuccino.
So here's another little monument here, walking down here. This is to the Royal Highland Fusiliers. And it's still got some pictures of some people who've fallen in Afghanistan and in Iran. And if you remember that our national motto is Nemo me impune lacessit, which nobody touches me with impunity, but here it's got Nemo nos impune lacessit, so nobody touches us with impunity for this, for the Royal Highland Fusiliers.
No, I've just got something I think I'd like to add. It kind of links a few things in together. We have this memorial to those that fell during the war. And I'd like to link that in a little bit with not only something we'll be talking about shipbuilding, but also might be of interest to those people in America that are tuning in. And that is that Glasgow was actually the place that JFK, John Kennedy, gave his first public speech on behalf of the government. It was in Glasgow. And the reason for that was that his dad, Joe Kennedy, was the ambassador down in London, and he dispatched his son up to Glasgow to give a speech. Now, Joe Kennedy famously didn't want America to enter. It was obviously a complicated issue in his head, but at that time he wasn't so sure. He wanted America to enter the war. But what happened and why he dispatched his son John to make a speech, his first public one on behalf of the government in Glasgow, was because the SS Athenia had just gone down. So that's the shipbuilding side of the story. SS Athenia was torpedoed. It was made on the Clyde and it was torpedoed in 1939 in the Atlantic, and many souls were lost at that time, including many Americans. So this was one of the impetuses to get America into the war. And it was in the Beresford Hotel, a beautiful Art Deco hotel in Glasgow, that JFK made that speech. So it's a story that draws together three different elements.
And another connection with the Clyde in the States is if you go to Southern California, outside Los Angeles, the Queen Mary is permanently docked there.
Yeah.
So the Queen Mary is built here in Glasgow. QE1, QE2, built here in Glasgow. I find this really funny that in Glasgow there's no big museum. There's no museum to all the shipbuilding went on here. I mean, there's nothing really to see it. And go to Belfast, and they've got the Titanic Museum for the ship that sank. You know.
That we've got a new museum called the Riverside Museum,
That's right.
which combines kind of the shipbuilding with what was my favourite, the Transport Museum.
Transport, yeah.
So it's a big modern one with a Spanish architect. However, for me, the Transport Museum, with all its smells of, days gone by,
The old
and
underground system
it
in
was
Glasgow.
just it. The Riverside Museum, yeah, it's absolutely stunning, but it's not quite. It doesn't quite have the same smell. It doesn't capture up the same sense of
But there are some great
years gone
parks here
by.
as well. I mean, you've got Glasgow Green, you've got the museum in Glasgow Green, you've got great museums, great art galleries, and we're going to cover some of them and later on as we cover more of Glasgow. Now that the country's got all on a level, it's opening up again, we can travel around a lot more, and hopefully we'll be able to visit a few more places in Glasgow as well. There's a little
The Tennant's
brewery.
Brewery, yes.
Brewery.
That's the brewery.
Yeah.
No, I can say a little bit about the Tennant's lager cans. But I mean, I don't know if for those of you who maybe lived in Scotland previously, or you may have heard about it, there was a marketing campaign back in the 70s where you would get the lager ladies, and that was ladies rather scantily clad, wrapped around your
In
can of
suggestible
lager.
poses.
Suggestible poses, something that probably wouldn't be acceptable nowadays, but that's one of the famous things about Tennant's lager.
I think it's safe to say, without putting too fine a point on it, that Glasgow has had a rather, dicey relationship with alcohol over the years. We've traditionally viewed as a city that certainly likes to bend the elbow, as we'd say. And I'm actually doing a tour later on today. I mean, I have not worked like many of my colleagues for so long because of the pandemic. It's just been a tragedy for our business, for our professional lives. It's been awful. I haven't had a tour since the end of 2019, but I've got one today, unbelievably, and it's interestingly an architectural tour in the middle of the city, and it's got a little bit of focus. The couple who are on it want to focus a little bit on Charles Rennie Mackintosh, and he is one of the people who really developed a whole style called the Glasgow style that had links to Art Nouveau. And the modern movement, modernism generally. Now, he linked up with a businesswoman, very clever businesswoman called Miss Kate Cranston, and she created the tea rooms that became so famous in Glasgow. And one of the reasons that the tea rooms were a real focus for her is she was very interested in the temperance movement. So she would not approve of this building behind us at all. She was very keen that people should have civilised discourse in a cultivated and sophisticated environment, and Charles Rennie Mackintosh helped her create that with the wonderful tea rooms. And somewhere, if you're visiting Glasgow, I really advise you to go. It's the Willow Tea Room on Sauchie Hall Street. It's called the Willow Tea Room because Sauchie is a Scots word for willow.
Yep.
And hall is a corruption of how, meadow. So it's the charming name, Meadow of the Willow Trees. But I thought I would slip in a little story about Kate Cranston and her temperance movement.
If I could just say also that these tea rooms that were developed by Miss Cranston were considered to be safe places where young ladies could visit and meet up with friends unchaperoned. They were considered safe enough, so you had your cup of tea, a lovely cake, and you would not be bothered by anybody.
And we will be covering more about Charles Rennie Mackintosh as well, because most Americans will have heard of Frank Lloyd Wright. In fact, Frank Lloyd Wright was influenced by the style of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, but we will cover him in a later date. I just wanted to point out another monument here again. This is one of the forgotten wars that Britain was involved in, but most Americans will know it, but this is dedicated to the servicemen and women who gave their lives during the Korean War, 50 to 53. Again, it's one of the forgotten wars. Britain was not involved in the Vietnam War, but Britain was certainly involved in the Korean War. So all down this little walkway that we're walking here, there are various memorials to various organisations. And I think it's quite a nice place to get. It's a nice tribute as we lead into the Necropolis. Now, as we walk across to the Necropolis, we're actually going to walk across the Bridge of Sighs, as it's known.
Just quite interesting, popped into my head about the temperance movement. Another strategy to take people away from the drink was to play a musical instrument. And in the 19th century, the accordion was seen as a very good instrument to play, an affordable instrument that didn't require you to have to go into huge manuscript versions of music, but had a more simplified way to teach people. So they said, get an accordion, and that was also connected with religion, and stay indoors and don't be naughty. Entertain yourself.
Get yourself a tambourine.
Absolutely. Idle hands are the devil's own playground, after all.
Yeah. So, as we mentioned, Glasgow became a huge mercantile city. The merchants here were very, very wealthy. As the city developed, the wealthy people moved further to the west of the city, leaving the east to be the industrial part. They moved to the west because the prevailing winds were coming in from the Atlantic, so the air was cleaner, whereas the air was very dusty over here, and you saw that from when we're looking at the cathedral. But the merchants wanted to be known even when they were dead. So they started to build these huge tombs here in the Necropolis. Now, when I look at the Necropolis, I always think of Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris.
That's what it was modelled on.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Joe.
Because it is so, I mean, the tombs here are spectacular. I mean, just amazing. And it's a great place to come and walk, and lots of people from Glasgow will come here in the evenings and just sit and walk, and it can be really peaceful. It's a really good place for just to contemplate. But the tombs are just fantastic. The architecture in the tombs, it's a sign of the wealth of the city that you can build your big tombs here. And there are lots of famous people that are buried, lots of famous Glaswegians of the great and the good are buried in here. But we're going to take you to one particular grave that I'm sure that anybody from the English-speaking world will probably heard about it, but I'll give you it in a wee minute. We're going to get some good views of the cathedral from behind as well. This is a continuation of the hospital. This is the maternity hospital, I believe, at the back here.
Part and then the maternity.
And then beyond it is the Lister building.
The new Lister building as well.
Yeah.
So the actual campus for the hospital is huge. I mean, there are quite a lot of large buildings
yes.
Or hospitals in Glasgow. People say that if you've ever got a heart problem or a lung problem, the best place to be is in Glasgow. Again, used to say that if you ever had any knee injuries, the best place would be Belfast Victoria Hospital.
Choose your ailments wisely, depending on where you're living.
Yeah.
Joe, could I just add, perhaps you're going to say this as well, but we're not the only ones to find, and I'm sure everyone watching is finding this quite a spectacular location, the Necropolis, but Hollywood directors also interested in these sorts of locations, and very recently, I think it was just a few months ago, the latest Batman film was being filmed. Right. So you can imagine with the correct dry ice and the Batmobile, or the Bat bike, I think it was, motorbike was zipping about here.
And I tell you, if you ever want to do a gothic horror story, this is the place to come as well.
Absolutely.
Absolutely amazing. And I just want to show you the entrance. You're coming into to the cemetery, you come across the Bridge of Sighs, and you get this beautiful edifice here. And it says here that it's talking about the joining bridge, the Bridge of Sighs, and it was to afford a proper entrance to the new cemetery, combining convenient access to the grounds with suitable decoration to the venerable cathedral and surrounding scenery. And it's the tombs of many generations who came here before. This is their resting place. And it is very spectacular. So let's move up a wee bit. So the person I'm going to introduce you to, if you're Scottish, you'll certainly know of this character. And you used to get this for your mummy. You'd be on your mum's knee if you weren't going to sleep. They would try and put the fear into you by telling you this wee story about this wee guy who's going to come knocking on your door. I think that this cathedral is better from this side than the front.
Yeah, absolutely. It has you get a slightly better perspective because it's sitting proud on the hill. It looks wonderful.
You get the enormity of it there. I mean, it is huge.
Yes.
And you don't get this in Edinburgh where you see St Giles, but St Giles is cramped, on the Royal Mile. But here you get this beautiful view of it. So, here we go. This is a tomb dedicated to the memory of William Miller, the laureate of the nursery, author of Wee Willie Winkie, born in Glasgow. So, I've kind of run out of my Scots is not that. I've been living in Edinburgh too long. So let's see we go here. Scots first, English second. So Wee Willie Winkie runs through the toon, upstairs downstairs in his nick goon, turling at the windy, crying at the lock, are all the wains in the bed for it's now 10 o'clock. Hey Willie Winkie, are you coming ben? The cat's singing grey thumbs to the sleeping hen. The dog's splendour on the flare and doesn't gie a cheep. But there's a walk-rife laddie that will nae fall asleep. Only thing but sleep your rogue, glowering like the moon, rattling in and wi' an airin jug, wi' an airin spoon, rumbling, tumbling, round about, crawing like a cock, skirling like a kenny what, walking, sleeping cock. It should be folk there. Hey Willie Winkie, the wains in the creel, wambling off a body's knee like a very eel, rugging at the cat's lugs and raveling our thumbs. Hey Willie Winkie, see, there he comes. Where it is the mither that has a stoury wane, a wee stumpet stoozy that canna rin his lane, that has battled aye wi' sleep afore he'll close an ee, but kiss for the rosy lips gives you new strength anew.
Hooray, well done.
I'll do it in English now. So it's Wee Willie Winkie run through the town, upstairs, downstairs, in his nightgown.
Very posh, very posh
A
indeed.
posh English accent. I think I'm losing a chapter page here. No, I've got it here. Okay. But there's a wakeful boy who will not fall asleep. Anything but sleep, you rogue, glowering like the moon, rattling with an iron jug, with an iron spoon, rumbling, tumbling round about, crowing like a cock, shrieking like I don't know what, waking all the sleeping folk. Hey Willie Winkie, the child's in a creel, wriggling from everybody's knee like an eel, tugging at the cat's ear and confusing all her thrums. Hey Willie Winkie, see, there he comes. Weary is the mother who has a dusty child, a small, short, little child who can't run on his own, who always has a battle with sleep before he'll close an eye.
Oh, I'm almost asleep already.
There we go. So I'm sure if you're living in Canada or anywhere in the UK and maybe in North America, you're familiar with the story of Wee Willie Winkie. Well, this is a monument to the guy who wrote it.
And Wee Willie Winkie has been spotted running up a close in Argyle Street, one of the main thoroughfares in Glasgow. So if you come along, you might also catch him.
Yeah. So we're going to end it here. I want to say a big thank you to our Glasgow colleagues here. So thank you for coming out, Alistair. Thank you for coming out, Lynn.
Thanks for inviting us.